Hey, HP family, I'm having to do this a little differently because I recorded it once and it didn't work. So now we're going to try it again. So this is the TREC Contract Updates that are coming January 3rd. Okay, now I'm like totally off my game. So I'm going to share my screen so we can kind of go over everything. And we are going to start with... that one. Nope, not that one. Oh, it doesn't let you just completely share the screen. Oh, there it goes. Share this tab instead. Okay, so let me go here. Share this tab instead. I'm learning as we go. Okay, so as you know, TREC has changes that are coming about starting January 3rd. Today, these were supposed to be dropped into zip forms. I am not sure if they're supposed to be dropped today, to where there would be 2 versions of the contracts and of these pieces. You cannot use the new version until January 3rd. Okay, these are not in effect yet. Remember, TREC has to promulgate their contracts prior to, or has to get approval. There's a regulatory contracts prior to them being used. So this is prior, this is coming after January 3rd. I'm going to show you the red line so you can see the difference between the two. So the first thing we're going to see is this blue section. Blue means they added things. So your first thing is about geothermal parts of a lease. So what geothermal is, it's water underground that's being used as a resource. So as a as an electricity source, as a water source. But geothermal means kind of like hot water, like hot springs. Okay. So we don't really have that here. We have that more in the area of like West Texas has some with all the fracking and everything. We have some in East Texas, Arkansas, if we live there, they have a whole hot springs thing. So, but they added in this as a leasing system because that's part of it. So that's what geothermal is. Then we get to skip to page 3. Now, page 3 is a big change. It's about the survey. A lot of the things that they have changed at TREC had to do with legal language. And we have all heard that the T47 is no longer mandatory. Well, that's a half truth because the T47 is still required, okay? But there's 2 different types of T47s. There's a T47 that's an affidavit, which is the one that we have always used, where you have to have somebody notarize it. It is a legal statement. But now, Texas Department of Insurance has said, well, you could have a declaration. A declaration is a statement made by the seller. We have not seen this document yet. It has not been produced to our knowledge, but it's basically a non-notarized T47. And so it basically said that you could use either of those documents. Then the next section, it talks about the buyer obtaining a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to closing date. If the seller fails to furnish within the prescribed time both the existing survey and the affidavit or declaration. Okay, so we've kind of had that before where they had to provide the survey or the affidavit within that time frame. Well, now instead of it being an or statement, it's an and statement. Your buyer is entitled to the survey and the affidavit or declaration prior to that date. If they don't have it, they are in full, you're fully authorized to have a new survey done at the expense of, and then whoever you checked, seller or buyer. Okay. And this also goes if the title company or buyer's lender does not accept the existing survey or the affidavit or the declaration. Okay. Then we go to number 2. Number 2 was the buyer obtaining a survey. So the buyer wanted a survey. And it said the buyer may, that's a new change. They changed it from may to shall. Shall means it's a must statement. So they must do that. The buyer must obtain a new survey at buyer's expense. Well, they changed that because they've changed it now to may. One of the things that people were doing and what they're trying to get away from is if you had a cash deal and your buyer's like, I don't need a survey, well, then you wouldn't check any boxes. And so it looked like that section wasn't complete. So by them redoing the wording on this to say buyer may obtain a new survey, you can check that box. And if they do, great. If they don't, that's fine too. They don't have to have a survey, but they want a box checked just to make sure that everybody understands that the buyer may need that. But then they put a caveat in there that said, if the buyer fails to obtain the survey, if they've said, yes, I'm going to get a survey, but then they fail to obtain the survey, they cannot terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum. Now, remember, paragraph 2B has to do with property condition to enable them to get funding. So they can't say, well, I didn't get a survey, even though it was my responsibility to get one, so I'm going to cancel the contract. So this was a loophole that they closed, which was pretty good for them to close that. Okay. 2 new things that they did. One is certificate of mold remediation. Keep in mind that every time there's an issue, they change the contracts. Okay, so let's talk about their mold remediation. This is a new addition. It says if the property has been remediated for mold, seller must provide to buyer each certificate of mold damage remediation issued under the property code during the 5 years preceding the sale of the property. Now, where did this come from? It came from really out of Houston. When Houston went through all of that flooding, all of those homes had to have mold remediation, and a lot of them did not have to give that certificate. And they did have that certificate because they needed to. But this is saying that house, if it went through mold remediation, you have to give that certificate. I also look at this as when we talk about Temple, because it's not something that really affected us in Houston, but in Temple, remember we had that tornado in May. A lot of insurance companies did not directly go out to those properties and make the changes. So a lot of them did not go out there and say, cover the roofs or fix the broken windows immediately. Some of them were months before that happened. Well, what has happened? We've had rain. If we have rain, we're going to have mold. So it's going to be mold remediation. So even though we talk about that being in Houston, we actually have it closer to home. So if you know that you are going to be selling a property in one of the tornado areas in Temple, keep in mind, this may be something that you may want to ask for if they've done mold remediation. But then the new number 11, which is now number 12, talks about required notices. This has been a huge bone of contention for everyone. And now, because remember, this is all about taxing districts, utility taxing districts. So we used to have where it said, remember, red means it's deleted. It used to be where it said MUD, WCID, which is the water control districts, and public improvement district notices. And people thought that was the only thing that you needed, but really it was any taxing entity for water. So now what they've done is they've put an example. Water, drainage, utility, public improvement districts. So Clearwater Underground Water Conservation District is a drainage and water taxing. And then we see Bell County 1 through 6. Those are water taxing districts. In Williamson County, they have in certain areas, there's a drainage. It's called a bridge fund. It's a bond. So anytime you have these bonds that are now taxable entities, you need to disclose that. Now, Over disclosure is never a bad thing, but under disclosure means that the seller's failure to provide applicable statutory notices may provide the buyer with remedies or rights to terminate the contract. So now it's saying it right there. We knew it because we know people who terminated their contract based on not having anything in this blank, right? But now it's stating it. If you don't disclose it as a seller, then I can terminate the contract and get all my earnest money back. So make sure that any utility, water, drainage, or public improvement district is listed. It doesn't just have to be a MUD or a WCID or a WCD, but it's all of those listed. Any taxing entity. Okay, then we get to come down to the fun part of this conversation. As of January 3rd, 2406, which is the buyer broker addendum, it goes away, right? It's that 2406 document. It goes away as of January 3rd. It is no longer needed. However, you will still need 2401 and 2402. 2402 is the broker-to-broker agreement. That is going to come into play on the last page of this contract. 2401 is the broker-to-seller agreement, and it's coming into play here. So, under number 12, your settlement and other expenses. Number 1 is the seller shall pay the following expenses. Remember, shall means must. So the seller must pay the following expenses. A is any releases of existing liens, including prepayment penalties, recording fees, release of seller's loan liability, tax statements or certificates, preparation of deed, 1/2 of escrow fee. And then brokerage fees that seller has agreed to pay. Okay, so that's your 2402. Okay. Because it's brokerage fees between the seller and their listing agent. Okay, and so if we want to get paid, we're going to have that 2402. And other expenses payable by seller under this contract. All right, so that's pretty normal. That's our pretty thing. They just added the brokerage fees. But I do want to talk about one thing. If you are doing a subject to contract, there's an issue with doing a subject to contract and using the TREC form. Because remember, it says seller shall pay the following expenses. That means they must pay to release the seller's loan liability. A subject to contract will not do that. So if you have someone bringing you a subject to contract, they cannot use this TREC form because it is in a direct violation of this contract. That's an aside. But, okay, on Part B. Let's go to Part B. Part B has to do with the seller paying the buyer broker fee as per the 2401. Okay, so you have the 2401, which is a compensation agreement between broker and owner. Down here in paragraph 6, it talks about sales, and the owner agrees to sell the property during the term. Owner will pay broker, which is the buyer's broker, a fee of 1% or a standard, like it could be a flat fee. Okay. The fee is payable during the term or after it ends at the earlier of the closing and funding, the owner's breach of the agreement, or the owner's breach of the binding contract. So we are eligible to be paid if the owner breaches. Okay. But, so using the information from A, we're going to go back to our contract. Wait, that's Farm and Ranch. Go back to our contract. Okay, there we go. And under B, it says the following amount to be applied to brokerage fees that the buyer has agreed to pay. Okay, this is seller expenses. Okay, but your buyer, according to your buyer's rep agreement, has agreed to pay X amount of money. So seller is now agreeing to pay buyer expenses at a flat fee or a percent of the sales price. You check only one box. Okay. That comes from 2401, where you have asked the seller to pay the buyer broker compensation. Okay. Then we added in C. Okay. C is the closing costs. Okay. Closing costs minus, it's not your commission, right? Because that was agreed upon separately. These are the closing costs. So let's say your seller is not offering buyer broker compensation through the listing agent. Remember, all of EXP is not offering listing agreement compensation or listing agent shared compensation. So you have to ask for it. Okay. You ask for it on 2401 to the owner. If the owner says yes and does the percent or does whatever, you put that information on the 2401 and on this contract. This area has deleted the need for the 2406. But then you can still ask for seller concessions. Okay. All right. So then number 2, it's buyer shall pay the following expenses. These are must pay. Okay. Seller must pay, buyer must pay. And it gives you a list of all of those things, including brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. Okay. Now, because that is written in the contract, VA went through on November 20th and changed their rules, which is why I sent out the AHP buyer rep agreement at the beginning of on Saturday. Okay. So the AHP buyer rep agreement, the new one, now states at the very end of it that the buyer is allowing us to provide our buyer's rep agreement to the lender if requested or required as part of their lending process. It is right now only with VA that we have to do that. Some lenders are asking for it for all different types of loans, and that's fine. If you want, if the buyer understands, because I didn't give them an option, because if they're VA, they cannot get the loan without us providing that document. Previously, we were able to just get around it, but now we can't. Most lenders are going to start doing a release where they can request it. Always ask for that release from the buyer. Ask the lender, do you have a release from the buyer allowing me to release that information to you? If they do, that's great. If they don't, because I put that stipulation on our buyer's rep agreement, they can have it anyway. So just know that's coming more and more. Okay. Federal requirements. Now it's no longer a federal tax requirement, even though if you have a foreign person, it's still a federal tax requirement. So I'm not sure why they just took out the word tax, but it's still there. They have to pay taxes on the money, and it's captured at closing. Okay, one item that they added to the list for the agreement that are parties to the contract is the addendum for a Section 1031 exchange. Why they did not add non-realty items addendum, I don't know, because that one is used more than anything else, but they added the addendum for Section 1031 exchange, and they did that because what were people doing in special provisions? Part of the 1031 is that you have to notify another party that you're doing a 1031. So people are writing that in special provisions. So they don't want us to write it in special provisions. So they're giving us a document, and we'll go over that in just a few minutes. Okay. Our normal thing down at the bottom. Okay. It says pursuant to a previous separate agreement. I want to talk about that for a second. Previous means prior to execution of contract. You have to have a 2402 signed prior to execution of this contract in order for this to be enforceable. So if you do not have a 2402 signed prior to the execution of this contract, the listing broker is not obligated to pay you any compensation. So you must have it. Now, how stickler people are going to be about that, I don't know, but it only takes one. So make sure that you have a 2402 signed between you and the listing agreement you and the listing broker prior to executing a contract. Now, can you hold up a contract because of this? Technically, sort of yes, but technically no. Okay. So the listing broker has agreed to pay the other broker a fee. And now it used to be just a blank line, and we would write in X% of the sales price. Well, now they've changed it, and they've put, here's the flat amount, here's the percent, and they actually wrote of the sales price. This disclosure is for informational purposes only and does not change the previous agreement. I cannot stress this enough, previous. Because there's so many times when I'm going through and reviewing y'all's contracts and stuff, and I'm like, hey, where's your 2402? And you're like, oh, I didn't get it signed. You must have it signed to get paid. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the 1 to 4 contract. Now we're going to go over to farm and ranch. And I need to, okay. So now we're going over to farm and ranch. The farm and ranch contract made some changes a lot like the 1 to 4. It added in geothermal, okay? It changed the whole survey thing, just like the other one did. So the survey part's the same. The mold remediation and the required notices are the same as the 1 to 4. We still have this ridiculous seller's disclosure that makes everything a counter, but whatever. This section changed. It is the same. It really didn't change. Okay. So it still took from B from 2401. Okay. And then it kind of got rid of that stuff. So anyway, that didn't change. Here's what changed on farm and ranch. Remember, it talks about federal requirements, and they took out the word tax. Okay. So part B was added because apparently there was a lot of foreign people buying up agricultural land and were not disclosing it. So the Agriculture Foreign Investment Disclosure Act of 1978 requires that a foreign person who acquires, buys, sells, disposes of, or holds an interest in the United States agricultural land must disclose such transactions and holdings to the Secretary of Agriculture. They have to file an FSA 153 with the Farm Service Agency where the land is physically located. You know, in every area, there's a Farm Service Agency, and it just may cover a wider piece of land, but they've got to figure it out. Has to be filed within 90 days of the date of the transaction. So remember, buy, sell. Failure to report is subject to civil penalty up to 25% of the fair market value of the land for a penalty. You have $1 million piece of property, $250,000 that is going to be a fine if they don't do this. And it says consult an attorney or tax professional. This is not a document that we will provide to the buyer or seller. Because remember, buyer and seller have to agree to have to do this. This is not something that we will provide to them. This is something they will need to get and that they will need to file. We are simply letting them know this is the rule. Same thing with the tax requirements. We're letting them know this is the rule. Once again, it has the addendum for Section 1031 exchange. But here, we're going to talk about this page. This page didn't really change. Okay? It didn't actually. It didn't change at all. But we have so many people that don't understand this page, including other agents. And so we need to talk about it. The one thing is the listing. It's a ratification of fee. This is your 2402 coming into play. The listing broker has agreed to pay the other broker amount or percent of the total sales price when the listing broker's fee is received. Okay. Who signs that? The broker sign it. So really, do you need a 2402? No, because it's right here on the contract. Okay. So on a farm and ranch, is it best practice to get a 2402? Absolutely. Do you have to have it? No, because it is written on the contract. But it's best practice to get a 2402 because you want to know that information before you ever submit the contract. Okay. This is the section that is really not needed because this upon closing of the sale by seller to buyer of the property described in the contract to which this fee agreement is attached, the seller or buyer will pay listing principal broker a cash fee. Okay. So that has to do with their listing agreement. Okay. So we don't really have to have that unless somebody listed it and didn't require a listing agreement, which is possible, old school. And the seller or buyer will pay other broker a cash fee of blank amount. Seller or buyer authorized. Okay. Big bold letters. Do not sign if there is a separate agreement for payment of broker's fees. So who doesn't sign? The seller and the buyer. If we are filling out the ratification area because we have a separate agreement, or if we have an agreement, this is who signs it. If there is not a separate agreement for payment of broker's fees, then we have to put that in there and we have to have everybody sign. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Okay. All right. So now let's look at third-party financing addendum. Third-party financing addendum did not change on the first page, but did change on the second page. What changed on the second page on buyer approval is that they have to have so many days for buyer approval. Buyer may terminate this contract. So that means they have the choice. They may terminate this contract within X amount of days after the effective date of the contract by giving seller two things. They have to have two things. They have to have the notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons for lender determination if they're going to use that provision. So, why do all these changes come about? Changes come about for two different reasons. One, because we had an issue and so we got to fix it. Or two, somebody abused this and we have to fix it, right? So where this came about is during the whole craziness of the past 4 years, people would put in contracts on multiple properties and they would not have an option period. So they didn't have a way out of the contract. So they would have executed contracts maybe on 2 or 3 different properties. And then they would terminate under this provision. And they didn't have to tell, oh, well, they couldn't get financing. They didn't have to say anything. They just said, we're terminating under this provision. So it allowed people to go under contract and terminate sometimes 10 to 15 days later. And the seller had no recourse. So now if the buyer is going to terminate saying we cannot get buyer approval, then they have to give a letter from the lender with their reasons. Okay. Like, why did they not qualify for this loan? So, and of course, if they get all that and they meet all that, then they can, get their earnest money back. Okay, the second part talks about property approval. So if the buyer lender determines that the property does not satisfy a lender's underwriting requirements for the loan, including but not limited to appraisal, insurability, and lender required repairs, buyer may terminate this contract on or before the third day before the closing date. Okay. You also have to give a notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons for the lender's determination. So that's been there. We had to say if it was a property condition, but we've never had to say it if it was a lending condition. And now we have to say for both. Now, funny thing on the FHA VA required provision. This has to do with the appraised value, the value of the property. That if the contract purchase price or cost exceeds the reasonable value of the property established by the appraisal, the 3-day notice of termination requirement in paragraph 2B does not apply to this paragraph 4. Okay, that directly contradicts paragraph 2B that says including but not limited to the appraisal. So they're contradicting themselves. So I expect this form to change soon. But that's what was on there. Okay. Next we have, okay, let's talk about the 1031 exchange. 1031 exchanges are investment properties that are traded like kinds. They're like kinds. Okay. So I have an apartment complex and I'm going to sell the apartment complex and I'm going to buy apartment complex, or I'm going to buy multifamily property. It's like kind. Okay. So it's concerning the property, and this is the seller or the buyer, okay, intends to use this property to accomplish an exchange of like-kind properties under Section 1031. Is it possible to check both the seller and the buyer? Absolutely. This is the notification that they are going to do a 1031 exchange. 1031 exchanges are a little bit more difficult, but not really for us, but they're a little bit more difficult for the buyer and the seller. So it is important that we disclose this. It also says the parties will reasonably cooperate to accomplish the exchange provided. And the non-exchanging party will not incur any additional expense or liability. The second part of this says the closing will not be delayed as a result of the exchange. Okay, but what if it is? So I expect this form to change some as well, because it doesn't give you any, what if it does result in a delay? That's a problem, because it is highly likely on a 1031 exchange that there may be a delay. Why? Because 1031 exchanges are completed using an exchange administrator. So it's a third party. Who can we not control? Third parties. We can't control the lender. We can't control the appraiser. And now in a 1031, I cannot control the exchange administrator. So the exchange administrator tries to work through everything. They're the ones that are working with the IRS to make sure that the seller does not have to incur capital gains. That's really where this comes in. But you ask, well, how do I get an exchange administrator? For one, you are not an exchange administrator. You as a real estate agent. That is not your job. That is not what you can do. If you have someone who needs a 1031 exchange, they can go through Nancy Carruthers here in Cove. She is a licensed 1031 exchange administrator. Additionally, I know another agent, they use 1031exchange.com, which is a company out of Arizona or New Mexico, somewhere over there. Okay. You have to have an exchange administrator because they need to file the necessary paperwork with the IRS to make sure this works. But just know, if it is for a 1031 exchange after January 3rd, then you're going to have this. Which one?
I was looking for, is there a fragrance thing in your spray?
It doesn't spray, but it's behind you. So you will have to have a 1031 exchange administrator. So that's this. This is the new piece to the contract. It is not available. It was not available in zip forms yet. as of last week, but it may be in there now. Because like I said, these documents are supposed to drop in zip forms today, but it cannot be used until January 3rd. So when we talk about January 3rd date, if you execute a contract on January 2nd, you don't need these documents. Okay. You still do things the way you were. It's only if you're going to execute something on January 3rd or after. Same thing. We're going to talk about the 2406. Remember, that's the broker addendum. At January 3rd and after, that addendum will not be needed on any contract. You will still need the 2401 and 2402 if applicable, but you will not need the 2406 after January 3rd. After an execution date of January 3rd. Okay. Wait, which one do I want to do next? Okay, I'm going to do this one. All right, backup contract. Okay, here we go with your backup contract. The backup contract completely changed. Completely. What they did actually like is they added in the process. They added the process. You know, everybody was like, ooh, I'm going to do a backup contract. I want to do a backup contract. But no one really understood how the process worked, because prior to this document, if you had a backup contract, like right now, you would have to execute the contract as a backup and provide earnest and option fee stated. And they would have to deposit that at the time that they had an effective contract. Now, I love this document because now you can do it, but if you have a backup contract, it says buyer shall deliver earnest money and option fee as provided in paragraph 5 of the backup contract. Okay, so paragraph 5 of a contract talks about earnest and option money. There is nothing that says that those two cannot be zero. Okay, that is the way to do this. On your backup contract for earnest and option money, put zeros in that blank. For a backup contract, you do not need to have consideration for it to be an effective contract. But if you do that on the contract, on number 2, it says buyer shall deliver additional earnest money and an additional option fee of blank to the escrow agent within, and I would say 3 days after the amended effective date of the backup contract. Okay. What does that mean for your people? They are not delivering earnest and option money to title as long as on the contract they're putting 0. But then once their contract moves into the first position, meaning the other contract terminated and they moved into the first position, then they have 3 days to turn in earnest and option money, as long as you put 0 in the front. So you can say, okay, on the contract, I'm not going to put earnest and option money, going to put zeros. But on this backup addendum, I'm going to say, okay, now I'm going to have $500 worth of additional option money and $500 of additional earnest money. Okay. So then once my contract goes into the first position, now I'm going to have those things deposited. You do not have to have it is still a viable contract if you put 0 in those blanks. A lot of people say, oh, I have to have at least $1 there. No, you do not on a backup contract, because you do not have to provide the seller consideration if you don't have a contract in the first position. Once you have a contract in the first position, you do need to have earnest money and option money, if you want an option period, to establish consideration for the contract. Okay. Consideration is just money that makes a contract valid. Okay. So and then it keeps going on about stuff that's in the normal contract. If the last day to deliver additional earnest money and option falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then it's extended to the next business day. The escrow agent agrees to apply the additional option and earnest money to the original. If we don't have any, it's the beginning. The buyer authorizes the escrow agent to release the additional option money to the seller at any time. Failure to deliver timely earnest money. This is just like in the contract. So failure to deliver timely earnest money, the seller can terminate the contract. Failure to deliver additional option money, you don't have an option period. Okay, so all of those things are just like the contract. What it's basically doing is just allowing the buyer to not put money down until they have a contract in the first position. So I really like that. Okay, the rest of it really kind of stays the same. So that was good. Okay, now I'm going to get in my soapbox for a minute and talk about this amendment. They added the amount in paragraph 12A1B of the contract is changed to 1%. This is allowing the seller to renegotiate your commission that they are covering on behalf of the buyer. In the contract, they originally had said that they were going to pay X amount of money as per the 2401. This amendment is allowing them to negotiate that like hell. Excuse my language. But if the seller has agreed on 2401, which is why it is so important to get that signed, if the seller has agreed to that, do not let them negotiate your fee to make the better deal. You have a buyer's rep agreement, and you have the seller on a 2401 stating that they will pay a certain amount. If you want to change that money to make the deal work, come talk to me first. Because you should not devalue yourself because of what a seller wants to net on a property. It is not fair. We do not ask lawyers. We do not ask doctors. We do not ask anybody to devalue themselves to make a deal work. NAR settlement is a pure thing of it. That attorney's getting $138 million of that settlement. I don't see anybody asking them, hey, I think that's a little bit too much money. Everybody's saying it, but not one person has said that's too much money. I think you need to change it. Do not let a seller devalue you to make this deal work. Come talk to me before you agree to that. There are some instances where that may be something that has to happen. There are, especially if we're going to be dealing with sellers who are going to lose money on a deal. If they're bringing money to closing, I understand that to make the deal work. But if sellers are netting $250,000 or $150,000, it is ridiculous and it is greedy to allow them to ask you to lessen your compensation just because they don't like something. So that is my soapbox. I just ask, you are independent contractors. Do you, boo? But you need to know your value. You need to know your worth. And don't compromise that. Speaking of independent contractors, I am going to, this is a little off topic, but I'm going to be sending out your new independent contractor agreements starting in January. I'm going to send them on your anniversary month, hopefully, because I'm supposed to do that every year, and I haven't done that. So it's not going to be the independent contractor agreement. It's your statement of understanding that you understand that you are an independent contractor. So we're going to be sending that. So I am hoping that this recording has worked, and I'm hoping that this live stream worked. because I recorded it on Zoom and it didn't work. So I'm really hoping it worked. So I will be sending this out soon to where y'all can all be able to follow it and things like that. If you have any questions about the new contracts, just remember they're in zip forms. They're supposed to be dropped today, but they do not take effect until January 3rd, after the legislative comes back in session and they can approve them. So just keep in mind, they are not valid until January 3rd. So anything that you execute prior to that should be on the contracts that we're using now, to including the 2406. So I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I'm sure we will have more contract updates as they change, because as you know, things are ever evolving. So you take care. We'll see you soon.